I am delighted now to take the focus away from us. That was, if you will, our look at what we've done over the last 10 years. And now we will learn from many others who have inspired us, whose work we have admired, and none as much as Professor Carol Gould. She's without doubt one of the most distinguished political philosophers living and working today. We are absolutely delighted that she made her way from the US, Hunter College, where she is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy, to Vienna today. She has worked on the very big questions, on democracy and on justice. For decades now, she has written all these wonderful books that many of you will know, where she explores the social roots of justice, the social roots of transnational institutions such as human rights, where she looks at the ways these play out and the way we can energize them, justify them, and implement them. And she will today talk to us about one of the topics that is probably most current and sits right at the heart of thinking about what is it that connects us, what is it that sets us apart, how do we think about that, how do we conceptualize that, in a talk that's called Solidarity Between the National and the Transnational. What do we owe to outsiders? This couldn't be more topical. Dear Carol, thank you so much for coming over. We're delighted to have you.
Clear. I use this to advance? Yeah, but this advances or this advances? Hello. Well, I'm both sick and very jet-lagged, but nonetheless, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to Alina and Barbara for the invitation. I think the work you're doing is very exciting. By the way, I've just written a paper on the same topic about informational privacy and so forth. So I wish I'd heard your talk before, but okay. So also I would note that I need as much solidarity from you folks as possible, because we in the U.S. are suffering politically, so we can definitely use your own support. So I just have a few little beginning things just to, I'm going to have to be brief. So how would you like it if the mouse did that to you? That just appeals to the importance of empathy in my own view of solidarity. So many people on both sides of the Atlantic have been wrestling with the priority that they should give their fellow countrymen or country people versus distant others. In Europe, of course, you've had especially the issue of the treatment of migrants or mistreatment of migrants from Africa, Middle East, and elsewhere. In the US, we have a similar problems with Trump's Muslim ban, increased deportations of undocumented Mexicans and others fleeing violence and hardship in Latin America, the so-called border wall that he's been trying to put up, drastic cuts in refugees admitted. So the issue this poses is the question of the priority that we ought to give to our fellow countrymen in this context, but also more generally in international trade and the impact on jobs. And what do we owe outsiders is what I want to address here. I was also asked to speak to the two senses or the various senses of solidarity in political theory, so I hope to get that in preparation to really addressing this difficult question. Should we always stand in solidarity with fellow citizens or other members of our own political community, or should we equally prioritize solidarity with oppressed or suffering others outside our borders? So in previous work, I have developed a conception of transnational solidarities, which is different from the usual one, which I will get back to shortly. in attempting to articulate the sorts of solidarities that are involved in transnational labor, social movements, political movements, as well as sometimes found among the connections among civil society organizations where they aim at either achieving justice or providing aid of various sorts. And I've called this network solidarity, where it involves a network notion of overlapping solidarity groups, which differ from the more unitary solidarities that you find within national communities. So normatively, I've argued that this involves action on the part of, so I agree with your emphasis, with the emphasis that your organizers have placed on practices. It involves action and not just sentiment. Action on the part of individuals or groups that stand with others with the aim of overcoming oppression or alleviating suffering. And this is to be distinguished from humanitarian aid, also different from charity. It involves a kind of readiness to provide resources or mutual aid. That's the old idea of solidarity that comes from 19th century thinkers like Marx and other socialists. So the actors need to exhibit also, in my view, deference to those they're trying to help or cooperate with, where the people that one is trying to support should take the lead in defining what their needs are or what actions will be beneficial. Sorry, it's cut off here. Okay. Anyway, I think it's also based to some degree on empathy with others, and I've written recently about empathy. But anyway, here's empathy for you. Different ways. So people who feel empathy or take the perspective of the other with some kind of feelingful identification don't have to share exactly the same situation. They just have to share some aspect. They're injured in some respect. Okay. And this is just to motivate you a little with a more gung-ho image. And some examples then: traditional labor union solidarity involving supporting and respecting pickets and strikes and sharing information and resources, the anti-sweatshop movement, solidaristic social movements that arose in opposition to dictatorships. This all seems in the past. Oh well. They still exist, like those based on economic cooperation, the Via Campesina, and as well as transnational networks of civil society organizations following natural disasters, for example, hurricanes or tsunamis. I'm sorry I'm speaking kind of fast because I want to get through a lot of stuff. So there'll be time for your questions and discussion. And these disasters are often exacerbated by inegalitarian social conditions. So just some pictures of, this is from Occupy Wall Street. These are solidarity movements. The ecological ones. Here's Haiti following Hurricane Tomas, of course affecting people living mostly in bad housing conditions, in poverty. So transnational solidarity, and I'll get to the unitary one and then hopefully get to the problem of relating them, can be based on shared economic interests, for example, against exploitation, or it can involve action on the part of advantaged groups who try to benefit less advantaged ones, and that can raise some problems of its own. I distinguish transnational solidarity from general human solidarity, so it doesn't mean that we all have to stand in solidarity with everyone worldwide, and that's kind of an empty notion, except maybe it's not so empty with climate change. But in any case, that's very difficult. So it's more of a concrete relations between people. It involves these newer network modes of solidarity involve overlapping relations of cooperation among groups. They may work together with specific projects in view. They use communications or social networks to organize and coordinate their action. So solidarity, though, I just want to note, is part of a larger theory. I think it's not the only value or practice that we need, and we need, besides that, institutional innovation. So, for example, to address issues that disproportionate hegemony worldwide. These are just issues that solidarity doesn't necessarily deal with 100%. World Bank spitting out money for fossil fuels. The Committee on Women's Rights will now come to order. That's my favorite. I just threw that in there. Okay, so types of solidarity then, just to summarize, besides the one I've just been talking about, there are unitary sorts of solidarity. I'll come back to the slide, but here you go. This is the Three Musketeers version, right? One for all and all for one. Or I think this is from the movie, which apparently was a big failure. I just read about the phrase that it's actually the sort of comes from the old Swiss sort of aphorism from the 1291 or something. Right, and it's written on the burned city hall and so forth. So Dumas just lifted it from there, but he popularized it. So back to unitary solidarity. This often applies to national communities, but it can also apply to more local or regional communities or to smaller groups of friends or coworkers, gangs, which is a negative version of it, non-normative version in my view, and tribes. The national case has often been based on pre-existing characteristics or ties among people based on ethnicity, with the various problems that poses, familiar to you all, I'm sure, I hope. So in that case, individuals are defined by their membership in the same group or community, thought to be characterized by shared goals. It doesn't have to be ethnically defined, and it certainly isn't in local context necessarily. I've for many years used the notion of common activities, which are sort of overlapping communities oriented around a set of shared goals or even just one, but that's addresses a kind of sense of solidarity. Also, people tend to think of each other as having a commitment to each other, which was especially clear in the Three Musketeers case, where they pledged them to each other. It involves reciprocal relations and mutual support within the group, so it shares some elements with network solidarity. And normatively, it would require meeting the basic needs of the members in virtue of their independence. Problems with this notion, of course, is that it glosses over diversity within the group, and it may not treat all members equally, which is obviously a big problem in national politics. And it can disregard or be exclusionary toward outsiders. So I want to address that issue, and that is a danger with conceptions of solidarity, because it isn't a universalist notion for the most part. So it can always involve exclusion. And even the networked one can. So the networked one is, just to clarify, to address Alina's request that I have a little bit about its functioning in political theory, the networked one emphasizes the connections among groups or that are regarded as external, where they cooperate towards a project, a particular project or goal. This could also be subnational. It doesn't always have to be transnational. And the ties among the groups are constructed. The basis is either shared interests, which is the Marxist tradition idea, which is standing opposed to other interests, namely the ones who do the exploitation. The other alternative route of this notion of solidarity is from the Catholic tradition, where it's oriented to relieving suffering. So when it's oriented around shared interests, the problem is that even networking solidarity can be exclusionary toward those with the conflicting interests. And when they're attempting to aid others, even in the Catholic, the helpful forms of solidarity to relieve suffering, they may take over for these others and fail to respect their agency. So these are various problems. I also think that generally speaking, we need to add in a dimension of understanding of social criticism especially in the networking case, because it's important to understand the context of those that one is trying to aid or who may be oppressed. So, empathy, that's nothing but a code word for compassion. Socialism. Cute. One more empathy cartoon. He's my best friend and he works hard all day. Couldn't you at least wag your tail? These are cute. Okay. So I have a section here that I'm going to skip. It's sort of self-critical a little bit, or about the dangers of the notion of a network, that it comes from technology and has some problems that affect it. It suggests equal nodes and openness, but many social networks are closed and the nodes are unequal. So maybe we should be talking about webs, which is at least organic, but even that doesn't always work. Okay, and so there's a distinction of these ideas of solidaristic groups from a mere aggregate of individuals, as Barbara and Alina pointed out effectively. So just to summarize before I how am I doing time-wise? 10 more minutes to address this difficult issue. You're going to edit out my eeks, right, from the video version. So in both senses, solidarity involves mutual aid, and the networking solidarity seems to me to be particularistic, but there is a sense, in my view, in which we can regard it as universalistic, and that is that it has a kind of universalistic intent, to use Kant's idea. It can be inclusive in the sense of if it's oriented to justice, then it can involve be open to anyone who wants to pursue that aim, even if their interests may be opposed. But in addition, the disposition to solidarity, the cultivation of the personality characteristics that we require to be solidaristic, of empathy and a tendency to cooperation, those can be universal. So even though, in my view, one is going to have a kind of choice about which group to join and try to advance, eliminate injustice at least, or help, nonetheless, the disposition can be made universal. So it isn't necessarily limited to a particularistic notion. And then I just want to emphasize again that it involves the creation of institutions to meet needs rather than just being a personal thing, as Barbara was arguing. A couple more images. We the people must help each other. Okay, so to get to the core of my argument, we can recognize that national solidarities in contemporary politics is obviously still very important. It plays an important role in supporting economic redistribution within a given nation state. It provides a defense against aggression. Many people value it, so that's something. But it may conflict with the requirement to stand in solidarity with distant others who are oppressed or suffering, or whose human rights need to be fulfilled. So this is just to say that it's also important in particular contexts, local communities, where people identify with each other and offer each other mutual aid. So I don't think it's a question of eliminating national or local solidarities, but how can you decide between the various demands of solidarity when they conflict, or between unitary and networking solidarities? Are there principles that enable us to choose among these? So I've already indicated that the disposition to solidarity can be cultivated generally. And so there isn't a problem in principle, though there's a problem in practice with respect to networking solidarities, because it's possible for the disposition to solidarity to be made universal, and it can be open to the participation of others, but that's But the core question for us, really, which we face today, is, given the importance of social justice on both local and global scales, what justifies giving priority to national solidarity from a moral point of view, especially since most nation states have historically been formed with highly contingent boundaries, often owing to their origins in war or violence more generally. So they don't really have a normative claim in those terms, although they have a claim in terms of history, and shared traditions. But I'm wondering whether national solidaristic feelings can be justified in wholly particularist and nation-state terms. Unsurprisingly, the answer will be no. It seems to me that any justification for prioritizing solidarity with co-nationals has to comport with cosmopolitan principles of universal human equality. And to my mind, this involves more than just a moral, abstract regard of treating everyone as an end in themselves. It requires also social and political equality internationally. So how does one understand this? I find that Robert Gooden's argument can be put to good use here in his article, famous article, What is so special about our fellow countrymen? He argued that we can talk about assigned responsibility. I don't want to defend his particular consequentialist version, but the idea that I would reinterpret this to mean is that the fulfillment of human rights, including economic and social rights, by nation states can be justified as a way of realizing human rights universally if these states and the societies that make them up can do so effectively for their own members. So they only have legitimacy to the degree that they full legitimacy anyway, to the degree that they meet the whole range of human rights, including economic and social ones, and are democratic, I would throw in, just to remind you. But if a given state is unable or unwilling to provide for the human rights of its residents, then others, whether states or individuals, have an obligation to help realize these rights. So I can't give the whole argument for why I think that we have universal obligations to support the fulfillment of human rights, which doesn't mean that I personally can meet everyone's human rights, but I think that universally we all can support the development of institutions that would realize them. But this often requires transnational solidarity to achieve, and also the development of, to meet basic needs. I'm going to skip this one. So one basis for sort of negotiating the national solidarity with the transnational is that national solidarity has to be framed with the commitment, sort of prior, more significant commitment to human rights of everyone, transnational. So we all have to do our part to achieve that. Another normative basis for dealing with this problem comes from issues in the case of exploitation, it seems to me, there isn't much of a conflict between the national and the transnational because from my rather old-fashioned quasi-Marxist perspective, exploitation is universal through capitalism, so that there are really shared interests across those contexts. And there's a lot of harmony between a subnational, national, transnational cooperation to control or maybe even transform a situation in which some people benefit necessarily and coerce others to participate. So labor solidarity, in practice though, this doesn't solve the problems in practice with respect to international trade, and unions of course are still going to be national. So that's only another in principle solution. Okay, here's money bags, but just to make the point. So I think a couple of more remarks because I want to try to hear your questions, leave enough time for that. In terms of specifically any given individual, I'm not really sure that one can make general proclamations as to how to negotiate the two forms of solidarity. You can say that some forms of solidarity derive from a particular job or functioning, as in labor solidarity. Others can be suggested by the practical matter of what one person is able to accomplish, such that if someone or some group or institution is well situated to provide assistance, they could choose to prioritize efforts along those lines. And I connect this to some degree to Iris Young's social connections model, where she makes a somewhat related point. But it seems to me that another way to look at the transnational, the national versus and the transnational is in terms of bringing in the idea of rectifying historical injustice as a basis for solidarity, for choice as to what you or your nation should be focused on. Obviously, colonial relations and their residue can support a focus on addressing wrongs that arise on the part of former colonizing powers. And similarly, although people are not always aware of historical injustices, they lead to unjust benefits, and this can be a ground for prioritizing forms of solidarity with distant others. So those implicated in systems of structural injustice, in my view, are obligated to stand in solidarity with those who are most oppressed or exploited by those systems. So that's another way that we can look at how to, where we should focus our efforts in addressing solidarity at national or transnational levels. And here I refer to, and to some degree criticize some aspects of Iris Young's view. But we do need to recognize that the notion of solidarity is inherently particularist, but I think it in the sense that it involves constructing or concrete relations among people. But in my view, they can be oriented, they can be relatively inclusive. So they can have solidarity movements, and the disposition to solidarity can have a universalistic intent when it's aimed at egalitarian and inclusive forms of justice and at promoting the fulfillment of human rights. I've also suggested the cosmopolitan principles are a framework within which state-based solidarity can be regarded as legitimate or illegitimate. And sometimes, though, the problem with emphasizing just one's job or what one is in a position to do, sometimes the most needy or unjust situations that require solidarity may be not related to one's job or even to historical injustice. Yet we still have an obligation to stand in solidarity with needy and oppressed people. Okay, but on the other hand, people aren't going to be able to engage in solidarity actions if their basic needs aren't met. So from a dialectical perspective also, it supports the idea that you do need strong nation-state institutions that would help people meet their basic needs. And I will conclude by saying that contemporary national forms of solidarity can benefit from adopting some of the openness, constructivist character, and orientation to justice that I've highlighted in many transnational solidarity movements. So it seems to me that if we're looking at national solidarity, we can learn a lot from the transnational solidarities that are oriented to justice. And the tendencies to exclusion, not only of some outsiders, but some insiders, minority groups, are obviously deeply problematic in the case of nationalism and nations. And the understanding of nations. So to regard the national community as constructed and open, in contrast, would involve seeing it as a project, and a relatively inclusive project at that. So it's not possible for it to be entirely inclusive, obviously. But not everyone can be admitted and made a citizen, but we still have to incorporate everyone present, and not just those who work hard or who are like the people who are present, but also many of the people who need to be admitted in order to fulfill their basic human rights. And then just a proviso that fairness across states, of course, requires agreements. I don't have to tell you this. You've been, very aware of it in the European Union. But they are in short supply, these agreements, and the transnational cooperation. But even absent such agreements, the obligation to admit exists at least up to the point of foreseeable adverse impacts on the capacity for human rights fulfillment by the existing population, and this would clearly support many more admissions than at present. Okay, I'm going to stop there.